Welcome to Sagely Speaking with Mary Bono, the esteemed former Congresswoman known for her insightful perspectives and vast experience. Prepare to be engaged in thought-provoking conversations with influential personalities, exploring a wide range of topics, from social issues, politics, and policy, to personal development, shedding light on important issues that impact our society. Now, here's Mary.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and before I introduce my esteemed guest for this episode, I'd like to extend a thank you to our sponsors who make this podcast possible: Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, or MAPTA, along with MAPTA Action, and Communities United for Smart Policy, or CUSP. All of our sponsorship information can be found on our website at sagelyspeaking.com. I'm grateful for their generous support in helping to make this podcast possible. So now to turn to my amazing guest, and I'm so thrilled that she's here. I consider her a friend, a mentor, and a huge thought leader, and just love her to death. So Bertha Madras is a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School and directs the Laboratory of Addiction Neurobiology at McLean Hospital. Dr. Madras developed the first addictions course for Harvard Medical School students and created the Cell Biology of Addiction course at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. She has served as Deputy Director for Demand Reduction in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is a presidential appointment, and she was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. In 2017, she was appointed by President Trump to a 6-member commission on combating drug addiction and the opioid crisis. And this is a pretty cool little fact. The Better World Report of 2006 cited her brain imaging invention as, and I quote, one of 25 technology transfers, university to industry, so one of 25 technology transfer innovations that changed the world. Not many people can say they're changing the world, Bertha, but welcome. You've changed the world. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for coming to Sagely
I wish
Speaking.
I could change the world on drug policy more than on brain imaging, quite frankly.
You and I had a great talk yesterday morning. I was at a dog beach with my dog and taking notes on a Starbucks cocktail napkin, which is where all great things are born, right? Great songs are written on cocktail napkins, and hopefully this conversation will be the same. But we talked about psychedelics. Yes. And the burgeoning conversation about the promise of psychedelics. I've been concerned. I don't understand the neuroscience behind it, but I certainly understand aversion and unintended consequences. Can you share with us your thoughts on where we're going as a country with psychedelics?
Well, I think that the country is racing far ahead of the science. I've been in the field too many decades, and I was the heir of the LSD that was used by the CIA in experiments on human subjects in the 1960s. And after the CIA canceled those experiments, I was handed over 100 injectable vials of LSD for human use, but I was asked to try to find out how they work. So I kept up very extensively with what was happening in the field in terms of the human consequences. And we have to recognize there is a long history of it. We have to be aware that generational forgetting is one of the great plagues of U.S. society. At that time, we had many young people experimenting with the drugs. We had many psychiatrists and other physicians who were experimenting with them on human subjects without any informed consent, without any guardrails whatsoever. And we ended up in a period in which the devastating consequences to kids experimenting with them, to physicians experimenting on humans, led to an absolute demise of psychedelics. People became very disenchanted with them. They didn't want young kids jumping off balconies. They didn't want patients who went in possibly with mild depression to come out much sicker, and in some cases permanently disabled because of these experiments. So that sounds alarmist, because right now we have many more guardrails in terms of clinical trials, in terms of studies. But what's happening is the same thing that's happened with marijuana. Marijuana was initially sold as a medicine and then as a legal drug, because once you give a drug the imprimatur, the label, that it's medicine. It implies that it's safe, it has medicinal properties. And we're seeing exactly the same playbook with hallucinogens. Because of the clinical trials, some of which are very promising, because of these clinical trials, people are rushing into state ballot initiatives, legislative initiatives. They're investing heavily on trying to get these hallucinogens passed for human purposes without the science to back it up. And I fear that we're going to end up with a massive problem, a giant retreat, and once again, these drugs could end up in great disfavor. And if I may just just continue for 2 more minutes, there are 3 questions
Please.
that we can discuss that every legislator, every person involved in ballot initiatives or voting should ask themselves. Number 1, how good is the science? Number 2, thus far, all the experiments that have been done, can they be brought to scale? And can they be brought to scale in a way that everyone will have access to their therapeutic benefits if they wish to do so? And number 3, what about the unintended consequences? Are we going to see a revamping, a reintroduction of the sordid history of psychedelics that occurred in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, when our society said enough is enough? Physicians said enough is enough. Politicians, everyone involved said we've got to put guardrails around this class of drugs because they're dangerous.
In my limited, experience, I am a lived experience person, having lived around addiction of some sort my entire life. So everything I feel is just what I've gleaned from my life. And of course, you have the scientific background and the knowledge base. But usually I think to people, let's see, how do we give you a healthier lifestyle? How do we encourage you to get fit, to eat right, to get proper sleep, to meditate, have some spirituality in your life? But if somebody's tried all of that, is it logical? You're telling me it's illogical that they would turn to a psychedelic to try to fix this last problem, whether it's PTSD, TBI, whatever it might be. And I also, like you, the unintended consequences, look, they are what always bites you in the butt. Yes. With policy. But this is potentially deadly. You mentioned suicide.
Well, suicide, psychosis, enduring psychosis. So the real problem that underlies all of this is that we have an epidemic in the United States of what I call internalizing disorders. There is so many emotional problems in the U.S. People feel excess stress, they feel anxiety, they feel depression. And this is from young people all the way into young adults and even middle-aged people. And everyone is looking for a magic bullet to fix these problems. And so when something new, and this is certainly not new, but for this generation, it's new. It's brand new, and there's hype about it on magazine covers, in publications. So when something new comes along and promises that it's going to erase all your sadness, it's going to make you more empathetic, it's going to remove post-traumatic stress disorder, it's going to remove your depression, even though you haven't responded to typical antidepressants, it's going to get rid of your alcohol addiction or your opioid addiction. These are simply fictitious and fictional narratives that are being promulgated. What we have now in terms of the science, we have an inkling of how these drugs work. We have an inkling that in a subpopulation that is incredibly carefully vetted in terms of who can be allowed in a study and who is not allowed, we have people who respond reasonably well in the short term. So some of the best studies we have are responses that last perhaps 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but we have to recognize above all that this is psychedelic-assisted therapy. It's not psychedelic a therapy, because every single clinical trial that has been done in recent times, not 40 years ago when they were disasters, but in recent times, there is a therapist holding your hand at the ready to help you. There is pre-session therapy that tells you what to expect. And there is, during this therapy session, which can last up to 8 hours, there is special music lists, playlists of music. It's in a living room that's comfortable with headphones, with a whole series of interventions which take into account the set and the setting of the individual. And then after the session is over, there's a therapist, there could be two, that try to help you make sense out of what happened the next day. There are follow-up phone calls. This is intensive psychotherapy that is assisted by these drugs. Now, to assume that you take a drug alone in a place that may or may not be soothing like these locations are, and that everything is going to be fine, is at this point pure science fiction.
I like how you say science fiction. I was expecting something to come out of your mouth like BS, but it's, it is remarkable to think that it's being pushed on us now. I mean, of course, there's money behind it, correct?
There is billions.
I hate to compare it to big marijuana.
Billions and billions of dollars investing in it. And unfortunately, the companies that have the imprimatur of being pharmaceutical companies are being, in some cases, disingenuous about not giving the cautionary story behind them. And they are promoting their clinical trials as if they are a done deal. These trials leave no questions about unintended consequences. They don't leave questions about all the people that have been excluded. I mean, you're excluded if you have suicidal thoughts. You're excluded if you have a family history of psychosis. You're excluded if you have any sort of psychotic-like reactions at any point in your life. You're excluded for many, many reasons. And what is remarkable is that in one study that I've looked at many of them, but one of them, they interviewed 1,000 people and only were accepted 50 into it, which means 95% of the people were found to be not acceptable for these studies. We have to take into account that in dealing with this with the general public, there has to be an awareness that these drugs could trigger something that is latent, that may not be obvious to you, but could trigger in an individual some adverse effect that could really be problematic down the future. We cannot dismiss the fact that they have positive results in a number of people who find them spiritually and emotionally beneficial. And to deny that would be also to deny the science.
Well, that's interesting. But when you talk about the billions and billions behind it, didn't we learn our lesson with the opioid crisis and Purdue Pharma? And don't we need some skepticism here about the motivations behind getting all this stuff out there?
The playbook is identical. It's identical for opioids, it's identical for marijuana, and now it's identical for hallucinogens or psychedelics. Basically, that's just a sanitized way of saying a hallucinogen. What is the playbook? Number one is that you don't take into account the history of these drugs. Number two is that people who are hyping are encouraged, and in fact some are paid promoters. The people who are concerned are dismissed as being fossils, pearl-clutching fossils, archaic old people, and so on. The amount of investment that's being done through ballot initiatives is the same playbook as marijuana. And the drugs are being touted as safe effective, non-addictive, and that was the same with opioids, the same with marijuana. So the playbook just goes on and on. And what we're seeing is a repetition that somehow we simply cannot learn as a country to be skeptical when someone says they have a magic bullet that's going to treat pain, or it's going to treat PTSD, or it's going to treat AIDS or cancer, hundreds of ridiculous claims made about marijuana's curative powers. And we just don't have an informed public that is skeptical.
So how do we disrupt that playbook? Is it the policy setters? Is it lawmakers? Is it the FDA? Look, and how many different federal agencies alone are there in this space on drug policy? There's at least 10. NIDA, how do we disrupt the playbook? I know parent advocates are trying, but at the federal level, we haven't learned.
And the most discouraging thing of all is that, for example, the FDA has recommended that marijuana be rescheduled into Schedule 3 now from Schedule 1. And if you look at the science and you look at the criteria that the FDA uses to approve a drug, marijuana does not fill those criteria. In fact, what the FDA has done, and this is, from my perspective, it's pure political pressure on the FDA to do this, because they have the most rigorous criteria for approving drugs. You have to know the dose range. You have to know safety versus efficacy. You have to have a specific disease that it's going to treat. You have to have evidence of absolute purity, reproducibility, knowledge of shelf life. I can go on and on. There are just dozens and dozens of criteria. They have to be pyrogen-free, which means no bacteria, no fungus, and so on. The FDA, if they put marijuana to Schedule 3, it'll be anything goes with that substance. It could be 90% THC, it could be a leaf, it could be a gummy bear, it could be a soft drink, it could be a brownie. All of these different products that have been made by the industry once the 2009 was the breakthrough with the Cole memo and the Obama administration. Once that breakthrough happens, anything goes, and it's completely in contrast to the FDA's criteria for all its drug approval process that has happened in recent years. And I am stunned that the rigor that they have developed over decades is going to be compromised because of politics.
How much political influence actually affects the FDA? I really felt that they were immune from it, and especially in the early days when I was fighting against Purdue Pharma and OxyContin or trying to raise the awareness, I felt that I sat there and looked at the FDA commissioner in the face, and it was as if she don't want to hear it. No political pressure, please. I don't care what's happening in your congressional district. We're the FDA.
I think that the FDA has been remarkably effective for our country for decades, and I have always praised them because of the safeguards that they have enacted to make sure that our pharmaceuticals are pristine and safe as best as we can do them. Because obviously every single drug that you introduce in the body is going to have side effects. But I think that this current decision is the first example of egregious political pressure. And I fear that if this happens, then via the ballot box, there'll be more and more legalization or medicalization of drugs that have no business being medicalized. And then the FDA is going to be pressured to schedule them as a medicine without the guardrails and without the safety, efficacy, and the myriad criteria that they used to have to make sure that our pharmaceuticals are safe.
Well, in the opioid world, the FDA it mandated a REMS, risk evaluation mitigation strategies, right? So they thought they were putting safeguards out there, but it definitely for a few years there, it didn't seem to be working. Are they talking about a REMS strategy, risk strategy?
They're
with
definitely
marijuana too?
talking
Okay.
about a REMS strategy for psychedelics. I haven't seen a REMS strategy for marijuana. With the opioids, the government, no matter how hard they try, they don't protect. In the long run, if there are people who try to circumvent the regulations. In the case of the opioids, it was very clear that the REMS went around certain, highly abused drugs at the time. What did not happen is that the FDA did not convene a working group that said, what is the evidence for use of opioids for chronic pain? And what kinds of pain? How long should people be on these drugs? How many pills? And what happened is that we had Percocets being prescribed, 90 Percocets for a tooth extraction, which the pain lasts a couple of days. We had people being prescribed opioids for lower back pain, and over-the-counter meds work just as well in general for these type of symptoms, or a sprained ankle, or so on and so forth. So we had certain guardrails. We had duplicate prescriptions, and Schedule 2, the licensing was a bit more cumbersome. But the real guardrails was what medical condition has been shown to be, that opioids have been shown to be safe for the long run. And they didn't have that. They didn't have how many pills for how long. And they never anticipated the level of diversion that we had. And the diversion was a massive problem. Because if you have 90 pills,
right,
you go in and somebody prescribes it for back pain, and you actually don't have a back pain. And on the street, you can get $40 or $20 or $80, depending on the area, for each pill. You're going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year pretending you have back pain. That's what happened.
Right. I'm going to just take a quick break. Look forward to continuing this conversation, but I'd first like to thank Communities United for Smart Policy for their support of this podcast. America's fentanyl crisis is putting unbearable strain on families and communities across the country. We need comprehensive action that stops the illegal flow of fentanyl across our border and provides our communities with tools like readily accessible naloxone to help save lives. Please join Communities United for Smart Policy and continue the conversation on X and Facebook at Cusp Action to help bring an end to this preventable tragedy. Back to Bertha and where we are, and I just mentioned fentanyl, which is a game changer. Of course, we've gone from trying to prevent people from becoming addicted, and now we're trying to prevent people from being poisoned and dying after one illicit pill. And it seems that we've gone into an acute crisis here. And out of in my opinion, what happened with pharmaceutical opioids over a decade ago. And here we are where we are today.
Well, as an example, in 2006, we had 1,000 fentanyl deaths in the country. And I pressed the panic button the minute I realized what the number was when I was at ONDCP. And we had a massive fentanyl forum at the University of Pennsylvania, where we got together law enforcement, mayor's offices, social workers, emergency department physicians, treatment providers, everyone in the room to say, here's an alert that's going out. You have to be aware of this. This is a very, very acute crisis in our country. That was 1,000 deaths. We now have 106,000 overdose deaths every year, and the crisis has just exploded. What are we going to do about it? Well, I think some of the most important things we have to do is start with prevention. If we don't stop the pipeline to drug use and addiction, we're never, ever going to end our public health disaster. That's number one. Number two, we have to look at who's supplying the drugs and interdict. We have people, organizations that are trying very hard to prevent people from being arrested for selling pure deadly poisons to our population. And we have to literally subdue those voices and summon the courage and the resolve to arrest and lock up the killers, because they are killers, people who are selling these poisons to others. The third issue is that we have to intervene with people who are on the pathway to addiction before they develop a full-blown addiction, which can be devastating and have a very detrimental course in their lives. And the fourth is we have to treat. And Carlos Blanco at NIDA has estimated it's going to take us 10 years to develop the infrastructure to have enough treatment providers for what the numbers that we're currently facing. That's really a problem. One way to expand treatment is to enable as many physicians and to motivate them to administer effective medications to treat opioid use disorder, which are buprenorphine, methadone, and naltrexone. We obviously have to expand the distribution of naloxone or Narcan in order to rescue people who are dying like flies in certain cities, and it's devastating to me what has happened to so many young people who've been cut off at the prime of their lives. And we're also seeing an increase of kids between 14 and 18 dying from a single pill because they're unaware. And even if they're aware that it has fentanyl in it, they are unaware that because they're not tolerant to opioids, they can die instantly if they've not had exposure to opioids. So we need public education, we need prevention, we need to address parents who have, no matter what parents think, they can have immense control on their child's attitudes towards drugs. We need intervention in every single healthcare system where people are screened for substance use and they're motivated to stop using. And we need much better treatment and make many more physicians motivated to treat with medications, because at least 80% of our population sees a physician once a year. And this is an opportunistic moment to help people. And if physicians are not motivated to do it, they are, in some ways, this is a dereliction of duty. We need to obviously expand the availability of drug overdose rescue, Narcan, but there's two other issues that I think we have to do. One is to re-examine coerced treatment, because if people are at risk of killing themselves, in psychiatric cases, there are states, there are regulations that permit this, and yet we have not exercised that kind of common sense to help people who are one dose away from dying. And we should never give up on even one individual. So I think we have to look at coercion as one of many possible ways of helping people. And the other thing that I feel is the undercurrent and the most important issue above all is our culture. We've come to accept drug use as a norm. We must not continue along this trajectory. This is not a norm. This is not normative behavior. And if we continue along this way, with hundreds, if not thousands, of new psychoactive substances that can be made, I'm not going to get into that, but the possibilities in terms of chemistry are endless. With fentanyl, there are hundreds of possibilities. With nitazines, there are many possibilities. With hallucinogens, I can go on and on. It's never going to end unless our culture changes.
Let's talk about that. You and I spoke yesterday about some successes around the world, what Iceland has done very healthy discussion, I think, to have about, give us some hope here on there are steps we can take. This isn't inevitable if we make some changes in our culture.
I think there are three changes that we have to, at least three. Number one is we have to get parents much more educated on the dangers of the drugs and educated on the fact that they do have power to change the course of their own child's behavior. And it is essential that we do that. That's why I'm involved now in a program called Harvard X, which is run by the provost's office, in trying to develop a teaching course for caregivers on how to prevent their children from using drugs and how to protect their children. It is essential that we get to the families. If you look at Asian families, for example, their drug use is far less their teenage drug use. There's far, far less endorsement of this kind of behavior by parents and their children, and the parents have tighter controls on their children. We have to learn from this, from other cultures, why so many Americans have a laissez-faire attitude towards what their children do, yet other cultures will not. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of changing the culture, I think that we have normalized drug use in a way that is just devastating for people who are vulnerable. There are people who use drugs and get away with it and function well. We have to recognize that this is not a 100, there's no such thing in anything regarding the brain that's 100%. And certainly there are some people that have used drugs for a lifetime or for intermediary periods in their lives that have managed very well. But it's certainly not true for everyone, and the most vulnerable are the ones that are going to suffer the most. So I think those are two major principles. I think the third principle is the isolation that we have produced by social media, because that isolation has given rise to kids literally living in a virtual world that is in so many ways emotionally unsatisfying. It's almost hollow. And what Iceland has done in response to a very high level of drug use amongst their youth is organize a vast array of social activities, athletics, music, dance, you name it, and to recruit as many young people as possible into engaging, not only because it empowers them to be athletic or to learn to play a musical instrument or to be part of a competition, but it also gives them the opportunity to interact with other people and remove the isolation, remove the solitude, remove the loneliness by doing so. And their drug use.
And that holds true but that's gaming too, right, Bertha? Kids on gaming, yes, they have their headsets on and they're interacting with kids online, but I would assume that's as dangerous as, at least if a kid is allowed to game all day or all weekend, I would assume that's as dangerous.
It's not healthy. There's so many studies showing that screen time, regardless of the content, is dangerous for kids. It is unhealthy. It gives rise to a whole cascade of social problems, internalizing problems. I'm not worthy, I'm ugly, I have no friends, nobody likes me, I'm depressed, I'm stressed, I'm anxious. These are internalizing problems. Every single thing that happens in my life triggers me to become paralyzed with inactivity. And just having these alternatives that Iceland has produced, their drug use amongst youth now is hovering around 5%, which is remarkable.
Wow.
Whereas in our culture, it's 3 times higher at least. And in some places,
wow.
There's some school systems I visited where superintendent has told me 80% of the children use drugs.
And then add vaping in, and that number goes even higher, which we don't need to get into vaping. But I want to, you touched on something, and again, the larger policy debates over the years, You and I talked briefly about Title IX yesterday and its significance in my life, but we used to have access to sports in school. We had access to the arts. And over budget cuts over the years and decades, those things have been deemed
not that important,
superfluous. Yeah. Not that important. Yet you're saying what we all know. These are very, very critical to the development of a child, an adolescent. I would say an adult too. We should never stop learning, but we're cutting this out. So logically, we should be advocating again, bring these things back into our school systems, which is tough because the budgeteers will say, okay, great, what do you want to cut? Reading, writing, and arithmetic? Of course not.
There's so much that can be cut that is, from my perspective, is just a waste of money. I hate to say this, but I at one point I volunteered, taught science in a lower elementary school because I couldn't stand the science that was being taught in the school. So I went in once a week, and the kids in the grades 3 and 4, their scores on the national science testing doubled in less than a year, because it is so easy to, first of all, and I had zero budget, not one dime. It was just volunteer. So number one is there's an awful lot of waste in schools that I think could be cut ahead of athletics. First of all, people believe that if you offer high school students a multiplicity of options. I've seen courses like graffiti in New York subways. Why are we wasting educational dollars on that? Why are we wasting educational dollars on understanding rap music or understanding? I won't even go into some of the details because it does reveal my own biases, but. Those are things that you don't have to. You simply do not have to have as part of your education. What you need are the fundamentals: how to speak, how to write, how to think, how to communicate, how to look at insurance policies, how to organize your economics. There are practical as well as incredibly important skills that you need to learn. And schools should shave down all the extras that are essentially irrelevant and are just a waste of time, and realize that having athletics, having art as an outlet is a wonderful safety valve, as well as a wonderful way to communicate with your classmates at a level which is what real life is. Because real life doesn't mean that you're sitting in a classroom all day long and having a teacher tell you something in a didactic way. Real life is communicating with others, cooperating, developing teams, competing at times, other times working together towards common goals. And that's what athletics and artistic opportunities give people.
Well, I'm going to just bring up something personal, and I hope you find it somewhat amusing. But Steve, my husband, is a former astronaut, and I was sitting through one of his lectures he was giving to a group one day, and he decided he forgot that I was an art history major, and he decided to pick on art history majors, that art history was superfluous and that we should do away with art history in college. But of course, we have this debate to this day, but he kind of apologizes for having said that. But nonetheless, one more thing, and I know we're about at time. I could talk to you forever and ever, and I hope you return to a big leadership role in Washington. I wish the ONDCP director was cabinet level, and I wish that person was you in the future. But I think that I don't know. I have hope. The Iceland study gives me hope. I think it's hard to get a parent to understand this crisis until it's too late. They always think it's going to happen elsewhere. And the nonprofit that I chair works very hard. We have a campaign called The Greatest Gift is a Conversation. that we want parents to talk to their children about the dangers of drug use and the illicit drug supply. Again, trying to give this a softer meaning, that rather than just saying no, which, by the way, I think is effective, but rather than, just say no, it's like, well, hey, reach out to your kids and have a conversation. And so that's what we focus on, and I'm hoping that gains traction. We had a campaign where we reached over 1.7 million mothers with that message to talk to their children, and hopefully it's a start. But you can call. You can.
I do think that it all begins at home, and I do not ever feel that parents are to blame. I think that parents, without the appropriate information, without the appropriate backgrounds, can just not have the stances that they could have if they had better information and better education on this. And I think that what is so critical is that we have to change the culture. The other day I was at a meeting in Washington, more than a few weeks ago, in fact, where every single panelist was a drug user. Every single one.
Was an active user?
Yes.
Okay.
And it was a group dedicated to solving the opioid crisis. And after hearing all of the folks, and the plea was, normalize drugs, destigmatize them, let us live in peace, and help us just be safe with drug use. And quite frankly, I listened, and I said, there has to be a reality check on this type of cultural change that we're entering now. And I raised my hand and I said, if we normalize drug use, what you have to realize is that the majority of people in this country do not use drugs. They may use alcohol, they may use tobacco, but they don't use some of the other drugs that really can get, notwithstanding the two that I've mentioned, that can really get people into trouble. And if you want our society to normalize drugs and simply focus on harm reduction, what about us? What about the majority of people who do not want their children to start using and want to protect them if it's normalized? What would you say to them? And one of the speakers on the panel grabbed the mic and said, so we have a problem because most people are not using drugs. We have a problem. And that is what is happening now. What we are listening to more and more in terms of the what I call the slide, the slippery slope of harm reduction and public policy, is we're listening more and more to people who use drugs and want to continue, and less to policymakers and people who want to avoid this as an enormous stress, enormous public health disaster on both our families and our country. And if I can have one final closing remark, I say this every single time I speak to people. I do not consider this a war on drugs. I never have, and I never will. I think the brain, the human brain, is the repository of our humanity. It is what enables us to read poetry, to create art, to develop music and laws, and send rockets into outer space and develop the Webb telescope and computers and all these amazing antibiotics and vaccines and everything that from the brain and from our brain only arise. So it is not a war on drugs. It is a defense of the human brain.
Bertha, I think that is one of the most beautiful statements I've ever heard, and so critically important. And when I think about you, I think, of course, of the old walk softly but carry a big stick. If I were on the opposing side on this issue, if I supported drugs and was a big harm reductionist, I certainly would not want to debate you. Because even though you are so soft-spoken, you just connect and you hit that ball out of the park. And so I hope you continue to do that. And we are kindred spirits. And just to close for me with harm reduction, I can't imagine saying to somebody, I love you so much, let me help you use more. And I know some people are saying, well, let me keep them safe until I can get them into treatment. And absolutely, there's merit to that. But the message should always be, let's get you into treatment and let's get you healthy. And by the way, recovery is possible.
Precisely. But, if you actually look at some of the harm reduction programs, some of the data I've seen, less than 5% enter treatment on, for example, these supervised injection sites. Less than 5%, because they don't have motivational interviewers to help people get into treatment. Most of them are manned by people who endorse and promote drug use.
Yep, and destroy the quality of life in the end. So with that, Bertha, Dr. Madras, I just want to thank you so much for this time. I know your time is very valuable, and I'm honored that you would be here, and I hope that our paths continue to cross often. I will carry your suitcase into those debates and cheer for you, as I know you're slaying the other side with your great words of wisdom about this problem. So with that, I want to thank our sponsors once again who make this show possible: Communities United for Smart Policy, Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse Action, and we would love your feedback as always. So if you have any thoughts, concerns, or questions, I can be reached at hello@sagelyspeaking.com. One quick shout out to a good friend of mine who just ordered a bunch of Narcan to distribute through her family and grandkids so that they would be armed with Narcan in the event of an emergency. So with that, please like, subscribe, and share Sagely Speaking. And I want to thank you for listening. Until next time, be well, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today on Sagely Speaking with Mary Bono. Remember, wisdom is a journey, not a destination. For more insights, visit our website at sagelyspeaking.com.